Okay, recording. Okay, let's start to get everybody in here. And the other editor-in-chiefs, they did receive that email with the Zoom link, so hopefully some people doing the other write-ons are able to get on. So, okay, let's get everybody in. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to give it another minute or so just for the last minute stragglers. There's always a few. So hang tight, and then we'll get going. It is recording as we speak, just so I wouldn't forget. But it is recording as we speak, and like I said, we'll get started in about a minute or so. Okay. Oh, there's one more, just as I say, okay. There we go. Okay, so like I said, welcome to everybody. Welcome to the first ever, I believe it is, How to Blue Book session. So we're pretty excited to be able to offer this session in addition to what to expect, but then also the How to Case Note that happened last Thursday, which are both recorded. If you're sitting here and it's like, oh, I forgot about those and need to go watch them, there is a recording posted, and we'll be able to send that out. So like I said, this is the first ever How to Blue Book session, and it's based on some feedback from some previous years, people finding the How to Case Note very valuable, and just wanting an extra little bit of help with the infamous Blue Book as well. So hence this session. So today's session is going to be run by three of our managing editors from the board for Volume 51. They are Duncan, Linnea, and Jacob. They'll be running the session today. And the managing editors, the reason that they're running that session is because their role on the board and for Volume 51 is this. This is their weekly role. They're the ones that new associates will have some of the most contact with in terms of your weekly tasks or your biweekly tasks that you do as an associate. And that's the authority checks, which we'll talk about a little bit, but then also those citations. And they're the ones helping you through that process. And a lot of times they're the people that you're going to be leaning on the most, and they're also leaning on you the most during your role as an associate. And they are the expertise when it comes to this blue book. They've really gained a deep knowledge of it, and so they want to be able to pass that on. Like I said, it's going to be run by those three managing editors for this year. We also have our editor-in-chief, Krista Hansen, as our associate editor-in-chief, Sophie Hill, here as well. So we have a great crew to answer any questions that you might have about this. So just a couple logistic things. Obviously, just like every Zoom presentation, there's the chat available, as well as if there's a question, just please raise your hand. And we'll try and answer most questions we can in the chat. If we can't, we'll obviously be able to get to those as well. And don't be shy to jump in if you do have a question. It is recording, so if you do have to jump off and you're like, oh, I gotta run because life hits, no problem. The recording there to take the rest of it. So with that, I am gonna hand it over to our great MEs.
Hi, everyone. I am Duncan. I will start this presentation, then I'm going to pass it off to Jacob and Linnea. Um, like Steve said, please feel free to ask questions throughout. Um, there, this is like a big confusing topic, or it can be. Hopefully it won't be after this, but it can be. So ask questions. Blue Book is a way of life, right? It's not just a thing you do once and never touch it again. Okay, screen shares go. So before we kind of really talk about the Blue Book and to frame kind of the point of the session, I want to provide some like overview of what associates do in law review. I happen to know that some of this is the same for journal, so this doesn't just apply to law review, but some of the terms or processes may be different with the journals. So just keep that in mind if that's what you're looking into. But associates in law review, I mean, the main task you do is essentially authority checks and proofs. Each of these topics could be its own presentation, and they will be their own presentations for those who are associates for next year, but we're not getting through all that today because we can't. Um, an authority check basically is blue booking the site, make sure the site's in good, it accords with the blue book. Hopefully you can see this. Yeah, the blue book itself. And you check that whatever is being cited supports what the author is saying. Um, Associates are assigned a range to above the line, ATL. You hear above the line and below the line thrown around a lot, ATL or BTL. And your task, depending on exactly where you're assigned, is to do an authority check or a proof. We're not going to talk about proofs, but a proof is another thing that associates do. Like I said, checking the statement against authority. Does the cited authority support it? And if it doesn't, I mean, that's a different question, but that happens sometimes. And of course, if the citation doesn't conform to the blue book, you fix it. So we're going to talk about that today. Blue booking. How do you do it? What do you do? I am assuming that a lot of you have at least some experience with the blue book. Hopefully, you've at least looked at one of these in your first year or 2 years of law school. Um, if not, don't worry. We'll get to some of that too. So to kind of frame this, you open the Blue Book Quiz, the journals, and Law Review have a Blue Book Quiz as part of Write On or your first authority check next year in August, next year in 5 months. You see your first site, and what do you do? The really short answer is that this varies by person, by what site it is. I think maybe your comfort level in the Blue Book and Blue Booking. Some things right off the bat might stand out to you because you are very familiar with like statutes. This is a statute, spoiler alert. Um, but loosely speaking, you identify the type of citation, find the rule in the Blue Book. We'll talk about how to find rules in the Blue Book. Assess local rules. So the law review has some local rules. These rules modify some of the Blue Book rules. We're not going to talk about local rules today. That's again another topic for another day, but they exist for you doing Write On. In a couple weeks, you'll get local rules. Don't sweat it. Uh, I don't think the other journals have local rules, so I mean kudos, but it's just something to be aware of. They modify the Blue Book in some situations. And so what I do, and Linnea and Jacob, we talked about this. We basically skim the rule. I mean, you look through the rule and what are the things that this citation, which at this point, is for a statute. What are some things that this citation is missing? Does it have extra information that shouldn't be there? Is it wrong font? Do we have symbols correct or not? And then you change it. I mean, this will be done in track changes, and you'll have 60 other citations to fix. But loosely speaking, the output is a correct citation. I hope this is correct. I did this kind of quickly, so hopefully that's correct. But we adjusted the font, symbols, subdivisions. We added a year. Um, Citations are sentences, so you add a period at the end. You kind of need that. You're surprised how easy it is to omit a period, but it happens. Okay, so that's kind of the frame of what we're talking about. Just real quick, I hope again this is a reminder for people, but the Blue Book is loosely split into two sections, three or four. You have the blue pages, which are practitioner oriented. Those are the first 60-ish pages of the Blue Book. Those don't come into play in journal or law review. The white pages, though, the rest of the like 200 and some odd pages, those are the substantive rules that matter. At the end of the Blue Book, you have tables, comprehensive index, and tons of examples throughout the Blue Book. I think that's one of the best things about the Blue Book is it's not just a list of rules like, I don't know, rules of civil procedure or whatever. They actually have examples that are useful. And I've gotten some questions from interested people about online versus physical copy of the Blue Book. It is 100% discretionary. The online version costs money, although law review and I'm sure the journals have free logins for associates and whatnot. There's also a free trial available. You can visit the Blue Book website, and your physical copy has an online access key for an extended trial. I would say I only use the physical copy, and that's partly because I just like the tactile sense of a book. It's totally up to you. I mean, a book doesn't go offline unless you lose it. The online version is always updated, and the online has a search bar, which is really just straight up magic. So, it's your thing. It's up to you. Okay, so I'm gonna start talking about some of the white pages. Again, there's 21 rules, 16 tables. These are like, I mean, this is like 99% of what you need for the Blue Book, except for local rules. These are used in an academic setting, like law review. Um, you also use these when you're doing stuff in the blue pages, like for a court or for a lawyer, or as an actual lawyer in a couple of years. Um, but these are where we look to the most. And I don't know what legal writing professors y'all had. I know when I had, and ones that several of my colleagues have had, basically had a day where we brought in our blue books and we added tabs. These are post-it notes all along. Sorry, this is kind of funky. Yeah, Linnea's got it up too. Tabs. And they're post-it notes about rules that matter the most or that come up to real quick. So it's kind of gotten to a point where if I'm looking for a rule, I can just feel along the tabs and I know which one is what, because the top one is cases, the next one is statutes, and so on. Um, like this picture shows. So I would recommend, like, in this presentation, have notebook open, and anytime you see asterisks next to a rule, add a tab in your blue book, or write out the rule in your notes and then come back and tab it later. It just makes it easier. You don't have to look up the index, or you don't have to skip through to find cases. You can just flip right there and you're there. Um, so going to start talking about some rules. Um, and what Jacob, Linnea, and I try to do here is, in our experience as associates, we reflected on the past year and what are rules that we saw authors trip up on. What rules did we trip up on? Either we didn't see it, we didn't see the error, and so we maybe missed something. What have we heard through the grapevine that other associates, other teams missed? Because it's complicated, right? There's 350 pages in here. There's 21 rules. There's a lot of stuff going on all the time. So we want to provide you some highlights of rules that are maybe especially important. And I mean, I don't actually know this for sure, but some of these might show up on a Bluebook quiz, so they might be ones that you want to um, take note of. So I'll start with, I mean, the basic kind of structure and use of citations in Rule 1 and typeface for law reviews in Rule 2. I hope everyone knows what a signal is for citation, but if you don't, these come up all the time, whether you are directly citing something or, the citation stands for something that reasonable but not direct. I see these missed a lot or misused. Another thing that's often missed is if you have uh, an introductory signal, usually you want a parenthetical, for example. Um, and then 2.1 and 2.2 are, I mean, they're typeface conventions. What kind of font are you using? Again, easy to miss, easy to forget, and it's really, I find it hard to remember when I'm editing to like find these things, and so these are ones that I mark. I always check no matter what's going on. And these correspond to above the line or below the line text. And I realized I didn't actually define like below the line what that means. So below the line is footnotes. In Word, in Pages, you have like the main body of your text, and then a line that cuts like a third of the way across the page. And then below that are footnotes. When we say below the line, we mean footnotes, basically. Rule 3, uh, look at bullet 1, everything. I mean, this comes up all the time. This is in citation or in statutes, in I mean, everything that has pages has subdivisions in it. These are things that we see missed a lot, things that are confusing. I think for me, the most confusing part, um, at least initially, now that it was confusing, I kind of remember it now, is when you're citing like a state statute, you basically use how that statute is organized. So you see this example for New Mexico. The Blue Book would have you um, include parentheses around sections, but the New Mexico statutes aren't structured that way. And it's just something you pick up on, but I remember it now because I would always miss it and forget that kind of thing. Um, so 3.5 is what I've marked. I think rule 3 is probably just you should have it tabbed and know where to get to it. Rule 4 covers short citation forms. I mean, id and supra come up again all the time. Something I always forget, and I was trying to memorize it before this, and I still don't, is the within 5 rule. Um, you just got to go to the rule and it'll tell you what within five means. I'm not even going to try and repeat it because I'm probably going to get it wrong and confuse everyone. So again, the Blue Book is something you got to just look at. I've been using it for what, 2 years now. I don't know where everything is. I have to look myself too, and I think that's true for everyone. It has a convenient, like a table of contents for the short forms for all the other sources, from cases to international materials. The rules on Supra and ID are very important because they come up all the time when you're doing law review stuff. Rule 5 quotations. I mean, we think everything in here, it feels like maybe a simple rule sometimes, but I think like everything else in the Blue Book, it's nitpicky about what exactly you're supposed to do. Like how do you format when you have an omission, when you have omissions. Word likes to turn that into I forgot what the term is called, but it messes with the spacing. And so something to always to look at. Block quotes. How many words for a block quote? 50. If you have 49 words, you don't block quote it. That's just how it is. But again, something to continue to remember. Rule 6, it's pretty short. It basically refers you to other sections in the Blue Book tables, specifically which Linnea will talk about. Um, a lot of abbreviations are used. Hopefully, people are familiar with T6, Table 6, which has a ton of the abbreviations. Something else too. I mean, T6 is I've actually worn out my tab. It's got a tear in it from like my thumbnail or my fingernail hitting it. So uh, you use it a lot. And of course, the online version, you don't. I mean, it's so easy to access, but you got to know these. Um, this is my favorite rule because it feels like it's useless. It's well, italics for style and unique circumstances. It's like, Latin words or non-English words that are used in English, are used, commonly in English. I think I've seen this come up never in law review, but 7D is just my favorite thing that it exists. It's a rule for what to do when you have a lowercase letter L if as a subdivision, because it looks like a one, but you want to make sure it's clearly an L, not a one. I chuckle every time I see this rule and makes me happy that that exists. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob that's next.
Yeah, well, like Duncan said, I am Jacob. I'm also a managing editor here. That's incredible about 7D. I didn't even know that that was a thing. That's my new favorite rule now too. Um, but yeah, moving on to rule number 8, we're on capitalization. And this will pop up, very frequently above the line, but also below a line, especially when you're typing titles, headings and titles. You want to make sure that, articles, conjunctions, prepositions that are four or letters or fewer, you don't want to capitalize those unless they're the beginning right after a colon. So look out for the words the or. Um, and then the one thing to really keep in mind with capitalization is the exceptions in Rule 8C. I know that I sometimes, and this is things that, we know these rules, but there's times where when you're typing a paper, someone's been typing it, they might forget. So they might forget to capitalize Congress, but they might capitalize congressional. So keeping that in mind, it's the small things that it's like, well, that might seem a little nitpicky, but we're in the business of being nitpicky. So keep your eyes open for that. Um, and then Rule 9, it is primarily on the titles of judges, officials. This rule is pretty short and sweet. Just keep in mind when it's above the line, when you're saying, Justice Ginsburg, for instance, you're capitalizing the word justice and you're capitalizing the name of the justice you're referring to. Below the line, you're going to have the name of the justice, and then, of course, followed by J or CJ if it is Chief Justice. And that's pretty much 9 in a nutshell. It's pretty quick. It's not too complicated. Speaking of complicated, though, we could have spent the whole time talking about cases here. I wish I could go spend the whole time talking about it, but we got to keep it short and sweet. So we're just going to go through some of the things that tend to pop up. Um, a big thing, and this will come up in general, but you want to refer to those tables, especially parties cited with case names. You know, for instance, if there's association, you're going to want to make sure that you have the abbreviation for association. Uh, Font is a huge thing, and I am notorious for, I remember really getting caught up in my early days as an associate, where, well, when is it italicized? When is it not italicized? When is it in small caps? So that is a huge thing to watch out for as well. Um, uh, Procedural phrases, that's another thing to keep in mind. So if you're seeing something that says in the matter of, there, especially if it's an older case, I find keeping in mind you're replacing that with either, I believe, in re, or there's other procedural phrases that you can look for as well. And those, this is what trips me up, those are in italics. So again, you're probably gonna hear me complain about, well, is it italics? Is it small caps? Because it still kind of trips me up to this day. Special citation forms, I think the really big thing, if you are looking at an unpublished or it's a pending unreported case, you're really going to want to look at 10.8. You're going to want to figure out, well, okay, is this through Westlaw? Is this through Lexis? And then, of course, going back to my old friends with short form citation, again, italics, not italics. When you short form cite, it's going to be, the name of the case is going to be in italics when it's below the line, but when it is the full form, it's not in italics. And again, that trips me up to this day. I still sometimes will miss that, especially when reviewing. So that is a big thing to keep in mind. Like I said, we could do a whole night on just Rule 10 for cases, but those are kind of some of the highlighted areas I tend to focus on that I know I personally sometimes miss. So that's, yeah. Constitutions is a little bit less intimidating. It's a much shorter rule. I think the big thing is it's going to be small caps as the font. Getting those abbreviations, and then, of course, symbols. The other big thing to keep in mind is when you are looking to state law, just making sure that you are referring to the tables to cite to the right authority, that you're using the right abbreviations for those states. Yeah. And then statutes, a little bit more complicated than constitutions. Debatably, maybe we could have a whole debate if statutes or cases are more complicated. I digress with that. The table and each rule kind of has these tables, but actually the basic citation form for statutes is incredibly helpful in this section. That's 12.1. It's right at the beginning of the rule. You're going to want to refer to that. And then, do you name a statute? That's a great question. If it's a famous statute, for instance, one that we can all recognize, so for instance, like the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, that's a big one. That one you would want to name. You don't want to start with you don't want to start with that. It's just going to be Americans with Disabilities Act. But if it's, let's say it's an unknown rule, an unknown statute of like Minnesota disposable waste statute regarding, like, no, don't refer to the name, just MinStat, etc. Yes, and then 12.31b. Yeah, again, if you're referring to the states, you're going to want to be able to go back to the tables, make sure that you're citing the right authority, because each state is different. They're their own thing. Want to keep those in mind. Session laws. Well, remember when I said you don't want to name an obscure statute? Well, if it's a session law, then you're going to want to name the statute. So it might have a long name that, you know, isn't famous, but you want to keep the name in mind. So keeping the intricacies noted. And then 12.9, special citation forms. You know, that's kind of the special list. So if it's something they're still working on, if it's unpublished, that's what you want to keep in mind. And then, of course, the short form citations as well are 12.10. Just being able to know that statutes have their own short form citation, and that's where you can reference it as well. Yeah. And then rules 13 and 14 are pretty similar. I mean, they're different in the fact that 13 is dealing with just legislative materials, but that fits a whole variety of things. You have to ask yourself, okay, it's a legislative material, but what type of legislative material is it? Is it an actual bill? Is it just a resolution? Is it a hearing? Is it a report? Or is it just a random document? Each of those sort of has its own category, and so you'll want to determine what category that belongs to. Some important ones to keep in mind. There are a bunch of abbreviations on table 6 and table 9 and table 10, especially when you're considering resolutions and just names of Senate committees, House committees. 13.4F is really helpful for state materials. And again, it's like any other rule, they're going to have their own short form, and that you'll find that at 13.8. Rule 14, pretty similar to legislative materials. It's administrative and executive materials. It's similar in the fact that they cover multiple grounds. It's not just one thing or the other, because administrative agencies, they can make rules, but they can also have adjudicatory hearings where they're acting more so like a court rather than a legislature. So you're going to want to ask yourself, are they adjudicating or are they rulemaking? And that'll just make you determine, okay, which rule do I cite to on Rule 14 with that? And again, their rulemaking, it's pretty similar to a statute, and their adjudicatory hearings, it's pretty similar to cases as well. So yeah, that's all I got.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Linnea Kolpa. I am also a second-year BAM student with Duncan and Jacob, and I'm also a managing editor for Volume 51. So I'm excited to see you all. This next rule is honestly one of my favorites. I feel like it's pretty straightforward. It's still a hefty rule, and it's very important to tab in your blue book. It's not something that I worked with my first year very much. I mean, obviously citing a lot of cases and statutes in our 1L memo, but for my personal long paper, I relied a lot on reports and excerpts from books, and some other materials. So this Rule 15 is focusing on non-periodic materials. And essentially what that means, if you don't know, is that it is not a source that's continuously published. So it's not like a journal that has multiple volumes. It's a standalone book, a report, a research paper, like a white paper, and even encyclopedias. So the main form of the citation will include the author's full name, the full title of the book, any pages you're citing, editors. Sometimes that can be harder to track down depending on where you're looking at the source, but it's always important to include that, as well as the edition that you're citing, and then the year of publication. Then there are quite a few variations on that basic citation, but it's still nice to kind of flip to that rule, look at the first page and see the example that the Blue Book has. That's what I often do when I know that I'm going to be citing to something new, is just go to the example that's on the first page of that rule and then kind of plug in what I know from the source that I'm looking at. It's especially helpful with rules like these where there is kind of that formula. 15.1 talks about what to do when there's variations in authors. So that could include, like, if there's more than 2 authors, you're likely going to use et al, depending on the local rules of your journal. For Rule 15.3 talks about what to do when there's different titles. Like if the book is titled something, but it's a part of another work that has a longer title, something like that. And then 15.4 goes over the edition, publisher specific rules, and anything to do with the date. 15.5 talks about how to cite to a shorter work in a collection. So like I kind of briefly mentioned, if you're citing an essay that's within a compilation of a bunch of essays in a book, it'll walk through like exactly what you're citing to and how to do that, which is nice. And then finally, 15.10, short form. This one is particularly connected with Rule 4, as Duncan had brought up earlier in the presentation. And it goes pretty in depth on how to use supra, just because you're not going to be using infra, which is another way of referring to previous sites in the text, but with books, you're going to be using supra or id. Rule 16, this is where the periodical materials come in. This is another very important one, especially when you're writing something like your long paper or you're reviewing somebody's article. These are periodic sources, so something that is continuously published, unlike books and reports in Rule 15. Law review articles, magazine articles, and also newspapers. These, this rule, when you flip open to it, you'll see that there are a bunch of basic citations. I mean, there is an example of like what to do when you're citing a newspaper article, what to do when you're citing a law review article, just because the citations are very specific to each different type of source. 16.2 in this rule also talks about what to do with authors, and there's a flag here on our slide just to note that this is a change in how the font is printed. So with books, the author will be in small caps, but in periodical materials, the author is just going to be in regular font. 16.4 talks about the difference, and 16.5. One of them talks about consecutively paginated materials, and then 16.5 talks about non-consecutively paginated materials. And the difference between those is just like if a source is, you know, running from page 1 to page 35, or if it's in a group of different works that start on page 1 on their own and then end on 10, and then start on 1 and end on 15. So just know which rule you're looking to when you're citing, depending on what is applicable to the source you're working with. 16.7 goes over some special citation forms. Some of these rules have little categories like that, as I'm sure you've already picked up, where they just flag what to do in unique circumstances. And then 16.9, again, goes over what to do in short form situations. Rule 17. This one doesn't always come up, but it's still a fun one, I think, because it shows you how to cite something like an email or a letter. You'll see one of the examples, the second one on the slide, is a memorandum from President Roosevelt to the Attorney General at the time. And really, these cites are just important to kind of flip to that page and look at exactly how they're being cited, just because the way you cite an email is going to look different than the way you cite somebody's dissertation. But again, very helpful to look at those examples instead of just Googling how to cite something. And then 17.5 specifically talks about what to do if you got any of these specific sources on an electronic database or from some other online place. Which leads perfectly into Rule 18, all about the internet, getting sources online from different electronic media, and then other resources that you cannot find in printed copies. Another super important one, and obviously is always increasing in relevance. The internet is Rule 18.2. The classic way of citing is up here on the slide as an example, Ben & Jerry's website. That is from the Blue Book. Basically, the title of the webpage that you're looking at is going to be in small caps, Ben & Jerry's, and then a link. Sometimes, again, depending on the journal, you might have to make what's called a perma-CC, which is like a permanent way of viewing that web page, so that if anything changes to the website, it's not going to be inaccessible in the future of that publication. And then, as always, you'll include at least the year when it was last visited, if it's not like obviously published somewhere on the site. Again, great time to look at the examples, just because there are so many different ways of citing anything that can be online, just like in print. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if like these rules ended up becoming more than one at some point, just because we have so many different print rules, but only one rule for all the things you can find online. So 18.5 talks about microform sources, and this is kind of rare, at least I think. I mean, it's not always necessary to actually denote if something is microform, but if the Blue Book says that if there's any situation where it would be ambiguous to not say that you got the source is actually found somewhere, then when it would be obvious, then you say it was microformed somewhere else. And so again, just the point of the Blue Book is to make sure that authors are as accurately as possible citing where they got their information. So that's kind of the main purpose behind that rule. 18.6 talks about what to do with films or other broadcasts. And so we have an example of just classic movie, The Godfather. It's in small caps, and then has Paramount Pictures and the year in parentheses next to it with a period at the end. 18.9 then is short form. All right, these last few, I will say I have not flipped to too much in my experience, but as soon as a paper that cites foreign materials is published, then I'm sure we would spend a lot of time in these next couple of rules. So services, this one is basically just lots of administrative materials and other commentaries that are published unofficially. That's just what's called services. And so you'd refer to that rule there. But then rule 20 is when we get into foreign materials. And there are a lot of specific rules as to what to do with materials that are not created or maintained in the United States. And so table T2 is actually very useful for any of these sources. It is not in the Blue Book because it is very long, but it is posted online for free. It is very extensive, going through kind of rules for every country. I think, yeah, the Catholic Church is also listed as like how they format their citations and for materials that are published by them. So like another very helpful source to look at online. You don't even need an account to log in there. And it can, as the slide says, modify other rules depending on the jurisdiction. So really good to be able to know where this resource is. Then the last rule in the white pages, the international materials. This is really just including like agreements that are made internationally, decisions from international courts, and then also something that comes out of the United Nations. There are lots of specific rules depending on the court. So this could be the European Court of Human Rights, for instance, or another international court, and then those commissions that I mentioned earlier as well. This rule too modifies other rules. So like the examples up here, it's just very important to go to the Blue Book and look and see if you can find something similar to what you're working with first before going to another source and looking. It's helpful to see with any of these just what you would actually do if you came across a source that comes out of the UN. It's not like you can just plug it into like a book or report citation. It's helpful to know where to look on that one too. And then tables, as Duncan said, one of the best parts of the Blue Book. Just anything you want to abbreviate, you can look here first. T1 goes over United States jurisdiction. So for example, this might be like citing to a federal reporter or something, making sure you're abbreviating that correctly. T6, the most important, amazing table that is definitely worth tabbing in your Blue Book. Super important. It's really, if you see any common word come up, so when I'm citing something, depending on the source, I'll just like look at each word and then go to the table and make sure there's not a more concise or abbreviated way to say that. So for example, I mean, I have mine pulled up right here. It's just a few pages of words, but some of them might not seem as inherent to you as you think. I mean, civil liberty, the phrase is C.L. So I wouldn't have necessarily known that right off the bat, but if that comes up in a title or something else that you're citing, it's important to go there depending on the source. T7 covers abbreviations of court names. So again, when you're citing something, when you're reviewing someone's citation, looking to see if there is an abbreviation for that, go to T7. T8 covers explanatory phrases. So these are words like argued or amended by, very, very legal terms. And then T10 goes over any geographical term. So this is like where you'll find state abbreviations, certain city abbreviations, and then also lots of different countries. It's not always what you assume. So again, great to go to the actual table to make sure. You'll probably know that Minnesota is MINN dot, but I mean, look up the difference between Missouri and Mississippi. It's you don't know necessarily which one is MISS right away. T16 subdivisions. These ones cover words like table or example or a chart, just important things that you'll probably be writing or checking for in a citation that, again, you might not know to check unless you know that a table like this exists. Sweet. Well, thank you all so much for coming. If you have absolutely any questions, we're all happy to answer, but for now, I'll turn it over to Jacob or Duncan if they want to say anything else.
I was going to say Blue Book requires practice. I mean, you you can judge me for this since I know some of you. Before law school started, I set out to try and read the Blue Book. It's like what a waste of like 2 hours. I mean, you can't read it first off, and second off, you don't memorize the rules. You memorize them by practice because it just happens, but you just have to practice the things. Um, Law Review and Journal provide probably, I think, the best exposure to a lot of stuff in the Blue Book in law school in a way that's conducive to learning things. Not all the rules make sense, just plain as they're written in plain English. So it's a great way to practice. And then, I mean, this last part here, I know some of you are probably getting ready for OCI. Law Review and Journal provide practical experience in site checking, authority checking, and editing. These are things that a lot of legal employers want. And whatever you do as a lawyer, or as maybe you decide not to enter the profession, the skills that you develop in Law Review and in Journal, and specifically using the Blue Book, will translate elsewhere. So it's a great thing to do, I think. Sophie?
I have a question to start us off with questions. I have a question for my fellow board members. How have you found that your experience as associates, especially with Blue Booking, has helped you either academically or with externships or with jobs? Have you seen any concrete return?
Oh yeah. It's funny because I was going into this session being like, dang, I'm about to talk about the Blue Book. Like, I hope I know enough about the Blue Book to really share. And then I was like, this is all I've been like, this is the only book that stays in my backpack. Like, it is referenced beyond belief. I mean, and you all will know, no matter what your experience is with a journal, when you sit down to write your long paper, you're going to be looking at the Blue Book all the time. I mean, it's you're citing sources, making sure they're correct, but especially with journal experience, it is just such an incredible crash course in like being detail oriented, and that is super translatable in lots of different careers and lots of different experiences. I know that with my experience in a clinic at Mitchell Hamlin, like it has been so helpful in writing memos to be able to easily just, reference, add a footnote somewhere and know how to add information below the line as easily as I could above the line. I didn't really know how to use footnotes before law school, honestly. I didn't do that much in college. So it's been such a great experience for my writing skills, but also just ease of understanding a lot more about the academic world.
Yeah, I think just building off of that, for me, it's a reference tool that you're never gonna not use. And being able to continuously use it, I mean, I see it as almost, like practicing an instrument or, doing something that requires muscle memory, you keep using it, and you basically keep the idea fresh. You learn new rules that you didn't know before. I mean, I'm still tripped up about that 7D rule. That's really funny. I can't believe I didn't know about that. But no, it's something that you're going to keep using throughout both law school and most likely your career if you go into the profession. I mean, just the other day, one of my friends who was working on his long paper, he's not in law review. He was like, "Oh man, I haven't used my blue book in like half a year. How do I do this?" I'm just like, oh, so I use it just nonstop. So again, just keeping that muscle memory of just this reference tool, I think is incredibly valuable.
One thing I would add, help law review and blue booking generally, or law review generally and blue booking in particular, help you give critical feedback and then be able to receive critical feedback and see how other people do that. Um, that happens in the real world a lot, obviously, and I think in law maybe it's more common than other professions to receive critical feedback a lot. And so it's a good way to practice giving that critical feedback and receiving it.
I'll jump in on a comment. So I'm not a managing editor. I'm a notes and comments editor, but I was associate last year, obviously. So what my experience last year coming from somebody I hadn't gone to school in almost 20 years. I did my master's almost 20 years ago. And to pick up the Blue Book, I was terrified. Like, what is this thing? And, Lark kind of like baby steps into it, right? Kind of slowly introduce you to a little bit. And uh, I like detail. I like having an eye for detail, and the Blue Book really hones that. And when I first started, I remember contacting my ME about every single little thing. I'm like, what is this? What is going on? And to just reiterate what the ME said, it's a muscle that you build, and by the end of it, you just start seeing things that you had to look up before, and you just start changing things, even if there's a space or italics, or there's a space in between the section symbol and the statute number, all these little things that you never would have picked up before. So it really strengthens some of those. Well, obviously strengthen those skills, but it just becomes almost a reflex as you practice as much. And then boiling it down to bringing it back to the Blue Book Quiz, which hopefully everybody's is getting all prepped up for and ready to go and write on after finals ends. And that process is going to feel a little intimidating at the start, unless you're already read the Blue Book a couple times like Duncan, right? It may not feel as intimidating to you, but it's that's another part of write on process is making you wrestle with some of these things and kind of wrestle with, well, what am I looking at? Well, first off, like, I didn't know what a session law was. I had no idea. I feel weird saying that now, but I didn't. And it's like, okay, well, what is that? And really wrestling with identifying what it is, and then how do you go about making sure that is accurate and correcting all those things and walking through those steps. And the way that the MEs today have broken it down is helpful. And that's what you're doing. You're identifying, well, what is it and where's that rule? But then also there's some rules that interplay with each other, right? And then flipping back to that table, and I think it's table 6, right? You go to that quite a bit. There's certain things that start repeating as you wrestle with it. They get a lot easier. So that's part of write on, is wrestling with it and kind of feeling at odds with it a little bit. So with that, we have just over 10 minutes left. We'd love to have people ask questions about it. And it could be about the Blue Book Quiz, it could be right on. But while we have our MEs on here, if you have any specific questions about the Blue Book, please jump in and ask away. They're the pros. Anybody have any questions? Expecting everybody to ace the Blue Book Quiz, right?
Even I'll venture one. Just related to what you just shared. So for someone like me who's relatively new to the Blue Book, this process is survivable and meant to be for beginners, not experts as well.
Sorry, so the question, this process meant for beginners, not experts?
Yes.
Yeah, I was a beginner, right? And walking through it in that write-on process, I had, gone through the blue pages in Lark, and hadn't ventured past that. Didn't have to yet. But yes, it's meant for beginners. I was one. So that's why the way the Emmy started in terms of, well, what do you do first? You have to identify, well, what are you looking at? And then flipping to that page and that rule, and then just walking through that process. And there we go, perfect. And that's really it, and it takes a little bit to figure out what you're looking at. But again, that's part of that write-on process. So yeah, beginners can totally do it. I did it. So Emmys, jump in.
One thing I will add that I think brought me some, not comfort, but I guess a little bit of ease doing the Blue Book quiz last year was just knowing that it wasn't timed to 15 minutes. You could kind of dig in a little bit. I mean, it's still not something that you have the whole summer to work on, but at the same time, there is some wiggle room, even while working full time, to kind of take a step back and then revisit, look at it again. I mean, yes, this is a very long book, but at the same time, with hopefully tagging certain pages and being able to recognize a few different rules, it can, the parts of the Blue Book quiz will be tricky, just so that you're really searching through the pages, but at the same time, like taking the time that you have to do it is hopefully can be seen as an ease of the quiz as well.
One thing I'll add is that the answers are in the Blue Book. So part of this is encouraging you and really pushing you to take the time to search out those answers. We don't give you things that you cannot solve without even by looking at the Blue Book. So that's part of it, is, are you willing to put in the effort?
I like to think it's kind of almost a legal scavenger hunt. You have this time, you have about a week to, like Sophie said, the answers are in the book. You just have to find them. You have to look, because I mean, I remember when I opened up my Blue Book test last year, I was like, what's wrong with this citation? And I remember thinking, that's a great question, because this looks perfect to me. I have no idea what's wrong with it. So the fact that you have time, I think we had roughly about a week. I don't know the time limit for this one, but you have significant amount of time to really delve, look, and the answers are there. You just have to look in the right place.
You'll have a week this year for the Bluebook quiz, the Wednesday to Wednesday. Yep, just to confirm that. So I was one that broke it up because I couldn't sit down there. I couldn't sit and do in one sitting. There's too much filtering. So I broke it up and did it in small chunks throughout the week last year because I had to dig in, and it took me a while, but again, the answers were in there. Once you find it, it's like, I found it. There it is. So any other questions? As you're thinking of that question, I want to make a plug for The Godfather being the best movie of all time. It was put there in the slideshow. Gotta be. It's gotta be up there. Yeah, and Duncan just put in the chat there, same here, I had a little one running around. So it's definitely doable, And that's why we give that full week, because we want people to be able to not just rush through it. So thank you, Duncan, for sharing that. Okay. Anybody, I guess it doesn't really seem like there's any other questions, but anybody else just kind of want to add anything to wrap it up?
I mean, I will say this is definitely worth it. I was so oh gosh, it was like Memorial Day weekend. It felt so busy starting my first like legal externship, working 45 hours a week, but I knew that like if I could just do it, at least I can say that I tried. And then getting a phone call about law review, I was like, oh, okay. So it's worth it to kind of commit to getting the Bluebook quiz done, working on your case note, completing the write-on process. It's challenging. Either way, no matter what the outcome is, the fact that you're able to do it is seriously an accomplishment. The whole write-on process, it is definitely a challenge, but as Sophie said, I mean, it's part of the measurement is just getting through it. So you got this. If you have any questions, we're here. But in the meantime, I mean, you can do it.
Well said. Good way to wrap it up. Great. Okay, so you'll be receiving more information. This recording, it will be posted if you want to go back and look at it. And it'll be posted on the Right On website. And we'll also make sure to get that out to you. But again, thank you. Questions, make sure to reach out. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.